Second part. The hunter left his room, or he thought he did, but he found himself back inside it. The window was now in front of him. It seemed as if he'd just charged in through the door. Dee turned around. Jan was in the doorway. "It's a fold in space," the hoarse voice said, sounding intrigued. "My, you're still tied to him, left hand. How tenacious of you. Mind if I come in? Oh, just for your information, cutting me down won't get you out of the fold. So, let's have a little talk." Dee raised his left hand. Jan let the tension drain from her body. She was relieved that Dee hadn't drawn his longsword. "Could it be you were playing nice because I saved those other two?" "You've got 3 minutes before you have to leave." After Dee spoke, his right hand flashed into action. All Jan saw was a momentary gleam. She hadn't been able to move a muscle. She couldn't even begin to guess what had occurred. Finally, she cried out in shock. "You were out for my blood," and backed away. Though she knew full well what Dee was capable of, she still couldn't believe her own carotid artery had been cut. She touched it to see. The wound had already closed. Not only that, but it didn't even hurt. Acting as if nothing had transpired, Dee put the blade of his sword against the palm of his left hand. The steel was wet and red, with blood from Jean's artery. He immediately brought the blade away again. All the blood had been wiped from it. "Tell me about the connection between Langland and Kraken," Dee said without going over to a small table. Dee said, before going over to a small table beside the bed. On it sat a ceramic pitcher full of water and a cup. He put the lip of the pitcher against his hand. With the slightest of slurps, the pitcher was sucked into the palm of the hunter's left hand. There was a sound of chewing. The pitcher was fired clay, that made water and earth. John began to speak by asking, "Do you believe nobles can be conscious of their crimes?" There was no reply. That was Dee. Jean went on. "Langland was one of the few in nobility who possessed a conscience. That girl, Iriya, was it? Well, he has long regretted the fact that they attacked her home, slew her parents, and abducted her siblings." Between the sounds of crunching and chewing, the hoarse voice grumbled something about it being a little too late for that. When they learned that the girl they'd bitten and left behind had become a hunter and was out to get them, he alone was delighted. At that point, his compatriots had a half-serious meeting about how to stave off her attack, and he was the only one who failed to attend. Not only that, but he hired me, and others, to secretly keep her and her friends safe. There were others. 5, all told. Did you think the girl had slain all those nobles on her own? Most were actually slain by her guardians. For just a moment, a faraway look came to her eye. "I'm not sure whether or not you'll believe me, but Langland is prepared to let the girl destroy him. That's why he defied his father-in-law and had us protect the girl." "Father-in-law?" Didn't you know? Langland's wife was Kraken's only daughter. Of course, 250 or 60 years ago she was destroyed. Not by you, but by some other hunter. Ever since, Langland has been a confirmed bachelor. That's one messed up noble, the hoarse voice remarked. No, I only happened to glimpse it by chance. But he has a photo of a human girl on display in his private quarters. A beautiful lass of 17, maybe 18. There was no name written on it. Is Kraken aware of his son-in-law's meddling? Vaguely. If he had any real evidence, I suppose he'd have done away with Langland by now. If Langland wants Iriya to attack him, why is he trying to stop me? Because you're in the way, John stated brazenly. Page break. Less than 10 minutes later, Iriya and Al were at the edge of an ancient swamp where the air was heavy with a miasma that distorted the sunlight and stands of trees. The place was the very embodiment of decay. The only saving grace was that they could still hear music playing at the festival. Just beneath the surface of the black water, algae moved. Fall in here and there's no saving you, Al said, surveying their surroundings with distaste in his eyes. Did the kid walk off alone? Nope. He had a tall, thin guy with him. It wasn't anyone from the village. Who was he? Meeker. The huntress had cupped one hand beside her mouth and shouted the boy's name, but Al grabbed her elbow roughly and tugged on it. What? There, he said, pointing into the swamp. Sure enough, the boy stood in the center of it, the water only coming up to his ankles. It was almost as if someone were underwater holding him up. Or... Iriya turned to Al and said, Go home. Or if you don't want to do that. At least find someplace safe. And no matter what happens, don't leave that spot. Not waiting for him to reply, she called out into the swamp. Meeker, come back this way. Her reply came from down at Meeker's feet. Iriya's eyes widened. She just noticed that on the water's surface, Meeker's reflection stood side by side with that of someone else. A tall, thin man. That's him, Al yelled from a spot 15 or 20 feet away. His eyes, too, were trained on the man reflected in the water's surface. Indeed, the man was standing to Meeker's right. It was reflected in the water. Yet there was no one next to the real Meeker. The man smirked. Al yelled from a spot 15 or 20 feet away. His eyes, too, were trained on the man reflected in the water's surface. Indeed, the man was standing to Meeker's right. It was reflected in the water. Yet there was no one next to the real Meeker. The man smirked. If you want this kid back, come into the water in his place. The voice came from the water's surface. Don't do it, Al said in a firm tone. Iriya made her decision quickly. Her foe could manipulate water. She knew as long as she remained on land, he couldn't hope to win. Okay, she told the man in the water, but in return, you have to let the kid go right away. Fine with me. I think it's only fair to tell you. I can't swim. Not to worry. All you have to do is look at me and keep walking. Let the kid go first. Otherwise, I'm not going anywhere. The man nodded, giving a push to the back of the Miko reflected in the water. Apparently the boy must have been through a terrifying experience, because he didn't say a word. Showing no happiness at escaping his abductor, the boy silently walked across the water's surface. With a plop, the huntress's foot sank up to the ankle, but there it stopped. Her footing was unsteady, but she'd get through this somehow. Planting one foot after another, she managed to maintain her balance as she proceeded in the direction dictated by the man reflected on the water's surface. Her progress was intentionally slow, so that Mika would have time to get back on dry land. If she reached the man first, he might take Mika prisoner again, and this would all be for naught. Every time one of them took a step, ripples spread across the water's surface, distorting the man's face. The two passed each other when Iriya had gone a third of the way. Go, straight back to D, she told him in a low voice, and the boy's face, a mask that didn't even register fear, bobbed up and down. When the huntress had gone 2/3 of the way, she heard Al call out, "He made it." She was glad he'd insisted on coming along, and wanted to shake his hand. Now she needn't hold back any longer. She'd find her foe's weakness and run him through. There was no hesitation in Iriya's heart. Once her feet had almost reached the man's face, he ordered her to stop. "Are you relieved that the boy is standing on dry land?" said the man reflected in the water's surface. It looked for all the world like he was just a reflection there. Not underwater. "Well then, stand right beside me. Once you do, you'll soon be just like me. Traveling through the water, we'll reach Viscount Kraken's castle in no time." "That'll happen," Iriya murmured in her heart of hearts. "In your dreams." Drawing her long sword with that cry, she drove it through the man's heart. It was exactly like stabbing into water, and the instant Iriya realized that, her body was enveloped by a great splash. Holding her breath, she madly tried to rise to the surface, but couldn't. The man was above her. Was he on the water's surface, or in the water? At any rate, he was holding Iriya's head down with both hands. Just as before, he was an image reflected on the water's surface. Nevertheless, Iriya found it impossible to break through him and reach the surface. Though she thrust her longsword at him, the result was the same. When she tried to move away, the man's image mirrored her movements. He stuck with her. "You won't die. I'll transform you once you've passed out." The man's voice echoed through Iriya's head, which felt like it would explode, just as she was running out of breath. The last air left her lungs. Black water rushed into them. She would have choked violently, but that would have required her to be able to breathe. Her vision grew dark. Even before she was aware of the heat, she was coughing half to death as she bobbed and sank over and over again. "Come this way." It was Al. He stood at the water's edge, beckoning to the huntress. She spied a pair of fire dragons by his right side. How did the boy summon them? She had to wonder. Judging from the heat, she knew the dragons had released their flames. There was still water in her lungs. Giving up on her question, Iriya began feverishly clawing her way through the water. Something caught hold of her foot. She turned around. The man was on the water's surface. It wasn't his weird appearance that held Iriya's attention, but rather the burn marks that clearly remained on the right half of his face and body. The fire dragon's flames could wound the water monster. "I'm not letting you get away. Come here," the man said in a voice like a wraith's. He pulled her closer. Wringing out her last bit of strength, Iriya spun herself 180 Wringing out her last bit of strength, Iriya spun herself 180 degrees. Dive. The man probably didn't realize what that cry from shore forewarned, until the instant the scalding flames once again shot across the water, vaporizing the lower half of his body. Having dived under to escape the boiling water, Iriya resurfaced to find the man had vanished without a trace. Once she'd swum to shore, Iriya, still coughing, confirmed that Miko was safe. Something must have been done to him, because his eyes were vacant and showed no emotion at the sight of her. "Gotta get him back to D. I need a breather," the hunter said, seemingly addressing herself. Before she turned to Al. "Thank you." She wrapped her arms around him. The boy became a stone statue. "How did you call the fire dragons?" With a flute." She seemed to be in a daze after watching his home burn to the ground. "But they got here so fast. It's almost as if they lived around here. Well, my house is on the other side of the swamp. It just happened to be watering time for them, and they get their water from the swamp." Once again, Iriya hugged the young man with all her might. Even after she let go of him, Al remained in exactly the same pose. "Let's get going." Taking the two boys by the hand, Iriya was leading them toward the village square when she heard something knifing through the air. Second part, and